Now, in the past, people who advanced pro-gay theology used to make, well, let's just say really bad arguments, all right? So for example, they used to claim that David and Jonathan in the Old Testament were gay, all right? Ruth and Naomi were lesbian lovers, and even Jesus and John were homosexual lovers.
Yes, I imagine it is true that if you want to find a pro-gay message in the Bible, your interpretations would have to be quite a stretch.
You know, and it's because the Bible says that John was a disciple whom Jesus loved. And in Isaiah 53, so they claim, it says that Jesus was cut off, meaning that perhaps Jesus was a eunuch.
Okay, I don't really see what that has to do with gay folks, but given that there is no explicit mention of Jesus being married, and given the fact that he believed that merely experiencing lust was a sin, then even if Christians are correct when they say he was sinless, he might as well have been a eunuch.
Now, of course, if you look at the rest of what Isaiah 53 says about Jesus, it says he was cut off from the land of the living, which means he was killed, not castrated. So nevertheless, these arguments were really, really bad in the past. However, today, people who advance pro-gay theology are offering more sophisticated arguments. And here is the new case for pro-gay theology. Here's their view in a nutshell. This is what they say. The Bible does condemn homosexuality. The Bible does condemn homosexual sex acts. However, it condemns abusive, coercive, or exploitive types of homosexuality. For example, gang rape, or master-slave sodomy, or pederasty, men who have sex with boys. But since modern-day homosexuals do not engage in those abusive or exploitive acts, therefore the biblical prohibitions do not apply to them.
That's not the best argument I've heard. There are passages that seem to condemn homosexuality per se, not just coercive sexual abuse. Matthew Vines has arguments that specifically address the explicit prohibitions. The passages I hear quoted most often are Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 and Romans 1:26. The passages in Leviticus say that it is an abomination for a man to lie with a man as with a woman. I don't think you can credibly argue that this only applies to sexual abuse. Abuse is not specified. This seems to encompass consensual homosexuality as well. Vines' argument, however, is much better. He points out that this is in Leviticus, and Leviticus is full of laws that Christians say they don't have to follow. I think you can make a convincing case that Christianity is against homosexuality, but if you are a Christian, I don't see the point of using a part of the Bible full of rules you don't think you have to follow anyway as a basis for that argument. You could use it to argue that Judaism condemns homosexuality, but if Leviticus doesn't apply to Christians, then you can't use it to argue that Christianity does. The passage in Romans says, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections." For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust toward one another, men with men working that which is unseemly. I don't think this passage only applies to non-consensual acts either. Vines' response to this is that it doesn't condemn homosexuality per se, but rather changing the natural use into that which is against nature. He interprets this as meaning people acting against their innate sexual orientation. In other words, it only condemns doing gay things if you are not actually gay.
Paul's reference to same-sex behavior is intended to illustrate this larger sin of idolatry. But in order for this analogy to have any force, in order for it to make sense within this argument, the people he is describing must naturally begin with heterosexual relations and then abandon them. And that is exactly how he describes it. But that is not what we are talking about. Gay people have a natural, permanent orientation toward those of the same sex. It's not something that they choose, and it's not something that they can change. They aren't abandoning or rejecting heterosexuality. That's never an option for them to begin with. And if applied to gay people, Paul's argument here should actually work in the other direction. If the point of this passage is to rebuke those who have spurned their true nature, be it religious when it comes to idolatry or sexual, then just as those who are naturally heterosexual should not be with those of the same sex, so too those who have a natural orientation toward the same sex should not be with those of the opposite sex.
This argument is better than simply dismissing Romans as only applying to sexual coercion, but I still think it's a bit of a stretch. If the passage is only intended to condemn going against one's innate attractions, it seems rather superfluous. You don't usually have to tell people not to do things they don't want to do. I'd like to remind you again that I do have a Patreon.